In this video, we're going to be discussing when you should rebuild your diesel engine. Definitely something wrong with this one. Hey guys, Josh with the Adept Ape channel here today, and today we're going to be discussing when you should rebuild your diesel engine. And I get asked this a lot at work, on the internet, and every forum you go to, there's people asking, hey, should I rebuild my Cummins, my Cat, when you should rebuild it, basically. And there's a lot of subjectivity to this answer. And before I get into the answer, I want to break the rebuild process into two processes. So there's when you must get a rebuild and when you should get a rebuild. So let's get when you must get a rebuild out of the way. So if your engine has spun a rod bearing, if your engine has no oil pressure, spun a main bearing, cam bearing, the gear trains come apart, you obviously have thrown a rod, dropped a valve, any of these major problems, you're going to have to get a rebuild. So there's really not a question of whether you should or not. You're going to have to get a rebuild. Now let's get into the subject of when should you get a rebuild? So I get this question a lot from RV owners, truck drivers. Hey, engine seems to have a little bit of blow-by, more than normal. Or, hey, it's eating a little bit more oil than it used to. Should I get an engine rebuild? So let's talk about some of the specs you might be looking at. And then let's discuss whether I would recommend you getting a rebuild or not. So most of your heavy-duty engines, your 15-liter on-highway engines, 13 liters, they don't have a set amount of fuel burned or mileage that typically says, hey, time for a rebuild. Some of your lighter-duty ones, let's say like a C7, they say if you've gone through 30,000 gallons of fuel, it might be time for a rebuild, but doesn't say you must have a rebuild. So let's talk about a few scenarios and what I would recommend to you if your engine's has these conditions and whether you should get a rebuild. So let's discuss the first major thing you need to think about when you're thinking of a rebuild, and that is your engine's blow-by. Or if you've had a compression test, you can even do a compression test on your engine if your compression numbers are down. Now, is this reason alone for a rebuild? And what's exactly a spec you should be looking at? Well, CAT's recommendation for high blow-by is double your horsepower. So if you had a 300 horsepower engine, if you have 600 cubic feet of blow-by per hour, that would be considered high. But would I rebuild an engine just because it has high-ish blow-by? No, I wouldn't. It can just be slightly worn rings, slightly worn cylinders. You might still have tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of miles left in that engine. Now, if your engine's running and the blow-by looks like this, well, not much you can do about that. You're probably going to need a rebuild then. Not only that, if your blow-by gets too high, it can actually start creating a lot of internal crankcase pressure. Now, on some engines that have crankcase filters, this can cause a high crankcase pressure code, which can actually give your engine a D-rate. If you're getting that, not much you can do either. You'll probably have to get a rebuild. However, blow-by is not always caused by worn liners. I have a video that goes into more detail on blow-by. Air compressor, turbocharger, valve seals, these can also contribute to high blow-by. And all engines have blow-by. Even a brand new engine with brand new liners, it's going to have blow-by. It's just really the number that matters. Now, what's another item to look at before considering a rebuild? Well, that would be oil consumption. If an engine has high blow-by, it typically has some oil consumption. And all engines, even new ones, are going to consume a small amount of oil. I would say if you have a 15-liter, you're probably eating about a gallon of oil, every 10,000 miles, or about every service, if it's a well-worn engine. Now, if you start eating a gallon every 1,000 miles, that might be something you want to look at as far as a rebuild. Of course, oil can be going other places. It could be going out your exhaust. It could be going into your air tanks if you have a bad air compressor. So it doesn't always mean you need new liners. So what are some other things to consider? So what about coolant consumption? Let's say you have a cracked cylinder head, blown head gasket. Is this the time for a rebuild? Well, not necessarily. Let's say your engine has low blow-by, it's not really eating any oil, but you've cracked your cylinder head, or have some sort of coolant consumption, or coolant getting into your crankcase. Well, if we pull a cylinder head off at the shop and your cylinders look good, I would say just put a cylinder head on it. You don't necessarily need to do a full rebuild to repair this issue. Now, the one caveat with that is if you have a diesel engine, you probably have cylinder liners. And cylinder liners are sealed with O-rings. And if your O-rings have never been changed, you might want to pull the packs out and reseal them. This doesn't mean they have to be replaced, though. The O-rings are meant to be swapped out if the cylinders are to be reused. So if you don't have much blow-by, the engine runs good, but maybe you overheated it, or you just have a cracked cylinder head for some reason, you can reseal the liners. Now, if your blow-by was already high and you had high oil consumption and then you cracked the head, I would say do a rebuild at that time. What if you just have leaking liners and the head's okay? Well, you'll still need to remove the head, obviously, to get to the liners and then reseal them. Now, just because a liner's leaking doesn't mean that it's always the liner seals, though. You might have high cavitation or a cracked liner. In this case, you would have coolant just passing through the steel liner that is caused by cavitation. And if one's leaking, the other ones are probably not far behind. So in that case, probably time for a rebuild. Now let's go into a few other things people might think of that you might need a rebuild for. What about smoke? What if your exhaust is putting out bluish smoke, white smoke, or black smoke? Well, in the beginning of this video, it showed a truck that was pouring out a lot of white smoke. Well, they didn't have an engine issue. There was actually some oil in the DPF from a failed turbo. Usually, any sort of exhaust smoke is not typically caused by a worn out engine. Now, it can be. If you're eating oil, it can be getting into the combustion chamber and getting passed out through the exhaust stream. But usually you'll have other symptoms. It'd be eating oil. But you need to find the root cause first. So black smoke's typically bad injectors or low boost. White smoke can be coolant leaks in an EGR cooler. It can be a pre-cooler leak. It can be oil passing through the turbo into the exhaust. The same with bluish smoke. Of course, if you are getting a lot of oil into your combustion chamber or coolant, that can be a cracked cylinder head. That could be a damaged cylinder, in which case you need to replace that cylinder or all the cylinders. So, another thing to consider. Now, what about low oil pressure? Does this mean you need a rebuild? Probably not. Low oil pressure has many causes or potential causes. Some of them catastrophic, some of them fairly minor. So low oil pressure can be, of course, a bad oil pump. You may just have worn bearings. You may have a faulty oil pressure sensor. Of course, there are worse options. You might have a spun bearing, rod main, or cam. In that case, you're basically looking at a new engine or at least a crankshaft or block. You might have a crack somewhere or an internal leak that could be causing this issue. You really need to find out why. Low oil pressure is not a reason for a rebuild. Now, what about just mileage or fuel consumption or total hours on an engine? Certain manufacturers do have recommendations based on the mileage or fuel consumed, but I tell people if the engine's running good, you don't have a lot of blow-by, not a lot of oil consumption, just run it. Just keep running it. Remember, the engine is there to just get you from point A to point B, or if it's a truck, it's there to make you money. And if it's down, or if you're putting lots of money into it for a rebuild, even if maybe your blow-by is a little high, I would just say keep running it until you need one. I've actually told several customers, they might want to just hold off on a rebuild if it just has slightly high oil consumption or higher than normal blow-by. And certain engines are typically higher in blow-by. A lot of the twin-turbo cats, the C15s, they have high blow-by almost from the get-go. You might do a rebuild on one, and it might almost have double the horsepower and blow-by numbers right off the bat. That's not a reason for a rebuild. You might have hundreds of thousands of miles left in that engine. It just has slightly high blow-by. I hope this video helped clarify some issues if you're thinking of getting a rebuild or whether your engine need one. Alright, thanks for watching.